call it a night. Your quiet corner of calm where you can find a moment of peace and relaxation.
Welcome to our channel. Tonight we embark on a fascinating journey to uncover the mysteries of the Druids. Please subscribe to stay updated with more intriguing stories. Take a moment to adjust your volume and find a comfortable spot where you can fully relax. The Druids, an enigmatic name that evokes images of ancient seers walking through verdant groves, communing with nature, and observing the celestial dance of the moon and stars. For some, they embody wisdom and mysticism, while for others, they carry a more ominous connotation. These perceptions have been shaped over centuries, influenced by historical texts and poetic depictions. In this video, we'll delve into the origins of the Druids, their beliefs, and their practices as they first appeared in Western Europe. We'll examine the dramatic shifts in how they were perceived over time. We'll use ancient and medieval sources, alongside archaeological and comparative analysis, to piece together the true story of these fascinating figures. Settle in, and let's uncover the hidden truths about the Druids together. Sweet dreams, and enjoy the journey. Every year, around the midsummer solstice, hundreds of self-identified Druids gather at the ancient site of Stonehenge on Salisbury Plain to witness the midsummer sunrise. For them, and for the many others who join in simply to experience the event, this moment represents a connection to the eternal, a comforting anchor in a world that often feels unstable and rapidly changing. It's a time to reflect on the deep rhythms of time and the enduring continuity of human experience. For some, it may feel like this tradition has always existed. In recent years, some modern Druids have expanded their ties to the ancient past. For instance, a group has claimed that the bones of a young woman, buried near Avebury around 4,000 years ago, are those of a tribal ancestor. They've even called for these remains to be returned to them for a proper burial. The Council of British Druid Orders, COBDO, supports this sentiment, stating that the sacred remains of their ancestors should be returned to the earth from which they came. Many archaeologists and scientists, however, see this as absurd. For them, artifacts like flint tools, pottery shards, and human remains are invaluable pieces of evidence that tell the story of our prehistory. These relics should be preserved for future generations to study with ever-evolving techniques. Critics argue that modern Druids are a recent invention with no true connection to the ancient past, a creation of imaginative minds satisfying personal desires. To some, they are harmless eccentrics. To others, they represent a challenge to rational thought. The fascination with Druids isn't new. It dates back to at least 300 BC. Over the centuries, each generation has formed its own opinions about them. The writings and stories that have survived offer a mix of observations, polemics, distortions, and wishful thinking, creating a complex tapestry from which we try to piece together a coherent narrative of Druidism. These references come from a wide array of sources across vast regions and time periods. Attempting to connect a mention in an ancient Greek text with a Welsh Tudor document to create a unified vision of the Druid is problematic, as it overlooks the discontinuities caused by time and geography. When we step back to examine the available evidence, we can categorize it into three broad groups. First, there are the observations made by Greeks and Romans, which were selectively repeated in later texts. The earliest of these might date back to the 4th century BC, while the latest are from the 7th century AD. Only a small fraction of what was originally written has survived. Next, we have the rich oral traditions of Irish and Welsh literature, which were eventually written down by Christian clerics between the 8th and 11th centuries AD. Oral traditions change with time, and Christian scribes often edited and added to the stories. Finally, after a period of silence, there was a rediscovery of the past as classical texts were found in monastic libraries and published. By the 17th century, Druids were frequently mentioned, and by the 18th century, the idea of the ancient priesthood was romanticized, merging with myths about the Celts. Our focus here will be on the real Druids, as recorded in classical and vernacular sources. The reinvented Druids, a mix of scraps of real data and imaginative embellishments, while fascinating, will be discussed briefly in the concluding chapters. So, who were the Druids? Classical texts describe them as philosophers, teachers, judges, keepers of communal knowledge about the natural world, and mediators between humans and the gods. Julius Caesar wrote that the Druids are in charge of religion. They oversee public and private sacrifices and give rulings on all religious matters. Yet, interestingly, they are never directly referred to as priests. In later texts and vernacular literature, they appear more as mystics and magicians. Given their wide range of roles, it's best to view them as a caste of intellectuals. Caesar's famous statement that in Gaul, the only people of importance were the Druids and the Knights, suggests they were on par with the tribal elite. The geographical spread of Druidism is difficult to pinpoint. Classical texts mention Druids only in Gaul, modern France, and Britain, while vernacular sources indicate they were also present in Ireland. Thus, Druidism seems to have been confined to the northern part of Atlantic Europe. However, the absence of references to Druids in other parts of Europe doesn't necessarily mean they weren't more widespread. Some scholars believe Druids were present wherever Celtic communities migrated, including into the Po Valley, the Carpathian Basin, Transylvania, and even into Anatolia in the 3rd century BC. The name Drunmetin, where the Council of the Galatians met in central Anatolia, translates roughly to sanctuary in the oak grove, and similar place names are found across the Celtic world. This suggests that Druids might have served Celtic immigrants in Anatolia, but it doesn't confirm their presence there. If we cautiously place the Druids in Gaul, Britain, and Ireland, the question arises, where and when did Druidism begin? Julius Caesar clearly stated that the doctrine of the Druids originated in Britain and was brought to Gaul. He noted that those who wanted to study Druidism in greater depth typically traveled to Britain to learn. Since Caesar had no reason to fabricate this statement, it's likely that he was accurately relaying what he had been told by Gaulish informants or read in now lost sources. Whether this belief was valid is impossible to determine, but it could very well have been true. We'll explore this further in Chapter 2. As for when Druidism emerged, there's little definitive evidence. Some suggest Druids existed in the 4th century BC, and it's possible, as we will argue later, that the caste has roots as far back as the 2nd millennium BC. There's no reason to assume that Druidism was solely a feature of the Latine Iron Age. How then do we know about the Druids? The earliest sources are classical writers from the Mediterranean who wrote about the barbarian peoples of Western Europe. Notable among them are Julius Caesar, 100 to 44 BC, Diodorus Siculus, late 1st century BC to early 1st century AD, Strabo c. 63 BC to AD 21 plus, Pliny the Elder, AD 23 to 79, Tacitus, AD 55 to 120, Athenaeus, FLC, 8200, and several Greeks who, in the first few centuries AD, compiled encyclopedic works using texts available in the libraries of Alexandria. The challenge is that, except for Julius Caesar, these writers were using second-hand sources from authors who had probably never encountered Druids themselves. Their accounts are partial, selective, and influenced by their own perspectives and the prejudices of their time. These sources need to be carefully analyzed to identify their original authors and assess the processes of transmission. We also need to understand how Druidism evolved and how the classical perception of the Druids changed over time. This is a dynamic and complex subject, with our only clues being the surviving words of a few Greek and Roman writers. It's possible that only a few people ever observed Druids firsthand. Julius Caesar is certainly one of them. He was in Gaul from 58 to 51 BC, during which time he made 2 brief expeditions to Britain. His famous account of the Druids in his war commentaries, De Bello Gallico 6.13, was likely based, at least in part, on his own experiences. One of the Gauls he befriended, Diviciacus, was himself a Druid. 2 roughly contemporary writers, Strabo and Diodorus, along with the 2nd century AD writer Athenaeus, use an earlier text believed to be the lost works of Posidonius, c. 135 c. 50 BC, a Stoic philosopher from Apamea in Syria. Posidonius traveled extensively in the western Mediterranean, including coastal Gaul, to collect first-hand information for his great work Histories, published in the early 1st century BC. Histories no longer survives in its original form, but was widely quoted and seems to have been the primary source for Diodorus Siculus and Strabo's information on the Celts and Druids. Athenaeus also drew from it, and some argue that Caesar may have supplemented his first-hand knowledge with details from Posidonius. Posidonius would have encountered communities in southern Gaul that had been influenced by Greek cities like Massalia, Marseilles, founded around 600 BC, and Roman armies marching through their territory throughout the 2nd century BC. When the Romans took control of the coastal region and the lower Rhone Valley in 123 BC, creating the province of Gallia Transalpina, the Gauls Posidonius met were likely those most affected by Mediterranean culture. Posidonius was aware that he was witnessing a society in transition, which is evident in his descriptions, where he often prefaced accounts with, "and in former times." The Posidonian tradition heavily influenced late 1st century BC accounts of the Celts and Druids. However, once the Roman armies had conquered Gaul and spread through much of Britain following the Claudian invasion of AD 43, many Romans, soldiers, administrators, and traders would have had the opportunity to encounter Druids firsthand. It is likely that Caesar's account was largely based on his first-hand experiences, and we know that one Gaulish Druid, Diviciacus, visited Rome and conversed with Cicero. A century later, the Roman armies fighting in Britain faced resistance led by Druids. These encounters contributed to the Roman perception of the Druids, although most references continue to rely on earlier accounts, supplemented by hearsay and anecdote. The most vivid accounts of the Druids are found in works by the historian Tacitus, who described their role in the Boudiccan Revolt and the destruction of the sanctuary on the island of Anglesey in AD 60. In later centuries, as memories of Roman encounters with Druids faded, their portrayal became increasingly detached from reality, transitioning into the realm of mythology and romanticized legend. By the Middle Ages, Druids were more often depicted as mystical figures in stories than as the historical intellectuals they had once been. The romanticized notion of Druids peaked in the 18th and 19th centuries, when they were idealized as noble savages and spiritual guides, far removed from the complex and multifaceted individuals described in the earliest sources. In summary, the historical Druids were a complex cast of intellectuals with a wide range of roles in society. They were most prominently found in Gaul, Britain, and Ireland, and their practices likely originated in Britain, though their reach may have extended further. Over time, the image of the Druid has evolved from that of a respected philosopher and judge to a more mystical and legendary figure, with the true nature of Druidism often obscured by the myths and romanticized depictions that have followed. The challenge in understanding the Druids lies in sifting through the layers of interpretation and misinterpretation to find the fragments of truth that remain buried in the historical and literary sources available to us. For many years, Druidism has often been viewed as a phenomenon mostly limited to Western Europe during the late Iron Age, a time archaeologists call the Latine period, named after artifacts found near Lake Neuchâtel in Switzerland. This view largely stems from the fact that Latine material culture is prevalent in areas where Druids are mentioned by ancient sources, covering the period from around 450 BC to the Roman era. However, this overlap doesn't mean that Druidism was confined to this time frame. It's reasonable to assume that the beliefs and practices of Druidism began earlier and were deeply rooted in the prehistory of Western Europe. In this chapter, we'll explore these ancient ritual practices, piecing together insights from the fragmented archaeological evidence that remains. Another common belief is that the Druids were the intellectual elite of the Celts. While there is some truth to this, it's important to consider the complexity of the Celts' origins and history. The Druids were active in Gaul during the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, and Julius Caesar noted that the people living in central Gaul called themselves Celts. Earlier accounts by Pytheas in the 4th century BC also referred to the people in the Atlantic region as Celtis. However, the extent and origins of the Celts are still hotly debated. The long-held view that the Celts emerged in West-Central Europe and spread eastwards and southwards is only partially supported by evidence. While there are records of migrations into these areas from the 4th to 2nd centuries BC, there's little evidence to support the idea of a westward spread. Yet, Greek and Roman texts mention Celts in western Iberia in the 6th century BC and in Atlantic Gaul in the 4th century BC, and there is growing evidence that the Celtic language was spoken in southwestern Iberia as early as the 8th century BC. How can we make sense of this? If we define the Celts primarily by their use of the Celtic language, the simplest explanation is that the Celts may have originated in Atlantic Europe from the Algarve to Britain and Ireland. This region was connected by intense maritime activity, fostering a common language that spread inland through trade and communication. By the 6th century BC, Celtic speakers were present in much of Iberia, Gaul, and likely Britain and Ireland. The famous Celtic migrations around 400 BC likely involved people on the inland periphery of this Celtic-speaking zone, who moved south and east. If this theory is correct, it suggests that Druidism may have been an integral part of Celtic culture, originating in Western Europe and spreading to West-Central Europe by the 5th century BC. As Celtic communities migrated, they may have carried their beliefs and practices with them to places like northern Italy and Anatolia. The absence of textual evidence of Druids in regions like Iberia or Central and Eastern Europe might simply be due to the loss of records. Thus, while we can't say for sure that there were no Druids in these areas, their existence there cannot be ruled out either. If we accept the idea that the Celts had Western origins, then Druidism, like the Celtic language, may have deep roots in the prehistory of Atlantic Europe. With this in mind, we'll examine evidence of religious beliefs and practices from the beginning of the Neolithic period in the middle of the 6th millennium BC up to the 1st millennium BC, when classical sources began documenting the Druids. The following chapter will delve into the archaeological evidence from the Latine period when Druids were known to be active. Archaeological records give us various forms of tangible data reflecting beliefs, burial rites, depositions, ritual structures, and iconography. These are physical manifestations of behavior influenced by belief systems, but they don't provide direct narratives or philosophies. While we can interpret this evidence, our interpretations are often incomplete and may be biased by our preconceptions. However, even with these limitations, much can be learned by examining the evidence objectively. At a fundamental level, we can observe a simple pattern in prehistoric belief systems, a balance between the earth and the sky. The fertile earth provided sustenance, essential for the community's well-being, while the sky marked the passage of time. Both realms were believed to be inhabited by gods who required appeasement. This oppositional model, interpreted differently by various prehistoric communities, offers a framework for understanding the beliefs reflected in the archaeological evidence. The treatment of the dead has always been a significant concern for human communities. Evidence of this concern dates back to the Paleolithic period, and by the Mesolithic period, 9th to 5th millennia BC, cemeteries of carefully interred bodies appeared along Western Europe's maritime areas. These burials often included items like red deer antler, shell beads, and red ochre, suggesting a belief in an afterlife. Over time, grave goods became more elaborate, with the 2nd millennium BC featuring notable burials, such as the one at Bush Barrow near Stonehenge, where the deceased was buried with bronze daggers, a scepter, and gold ornaments. The temptation is to see these grave goods as personal items for the afterlife, but they may also have represented how the deceased's lineage wanted to be perceived. Death in many societies is seen as a process, a rite of passage that begins with the last breath and ends when the spirit is at rest. During this period, the body may be treated in various ways, including being displayed to assure others of the death. Grave goods might not be personal items of the deceased, but could reflect the lineage's status and how they wanted to be seen. In some societies, the process was extended, as seen in the 4th and 3rd millennium BC megalithic tombs and earthen long barrows, where bodies were laid out in timber mortuary enclosures or megalithic chambers until closure rituals were performed. These practices suggest complex beliefs, possibly related to elite lineages maintaining tombs until the last member had died. The 2nd millennium BC saw a shift to single burials, which might seem like a major change in belief systems. However, the rows of barrows in southern Britain might represent the burial grounds of single lineages, ceasing to grow when the last member died. Attempts to quantify burial numbers suggest that only a fraction of the population received careful burials, with others likely disposed of through excarnation, exposing the body to the elements. This dichotomy in burial practices, some consigned to the earth and others to the sky, mirrors the later practice of cremation, where the spirit is released to the sky and the ashes are buried in the ground. Despite changes over time and regional differences, it's clear that the belief systems surrounding death were sophisticated. They likely involved a sense of the spirit leaving the body and a belief in the protective power of earth and sky deities. Beyond this, however, it is difficult to venture. The question of human sacrifice is worth considering, though conclusive evidence is scarce. At the 3rd millennium BC site of Hambledon Hill in Dorset, human skulls were found in ditches, which could suggest sacrifice, but they might also represent ancestor veneration. As with much archaeological evidence, multiple interpretations are possible. The ability of European communities to recognize and chart the movements of celestial bodies likely dates back to the Paleolithic period, when navigation by the stars was essential for mobile hunting bands. Seasonal changes would have been crucial for timing tasks in the annual cycle, and for maritime communities, tides linked to lunar cycles would have offered a precise system for tracking time. The disappearance of the sun each evening would have been a source of wonder, focusing attention on celestial bodies as indicators of the natural world cycles. As communities became more sedentary with the spread of farming in the 6th millennium BC, they developed a deeper understanding of the solar and lunar calendars, as shown by the careful alignment of megalithic tombs and other monuments built in the 4th and 3rd millennia BC. The Great Passage tomb of New Grange in Ireland's Boyne Valley, aligned to capture the rays of the midwinter solstice sunrise, and the Passage grave at Maze How on Orkney, aligned with the midwinter sunset, demonstrate this understanding. Other monuments, like Stonehenge, were similarly aligned with significant celestial events. These structures suggest that by around 3000 BC, Atlantic European communities had developed a sophisticated understanding of time, which they monumentalized in their architecture. The motivation behind these structures is unclear, perhaps to honor the gods, harness the power of special days, or chart the passing of the year. It's possible that these communities were demonstrating their knowledge of and control over the natural world, entering into a partnership with the deities to maintain order in the chaos of nature. The individuals who made these observations and led the construction of these monuments were likely revered as keepers of knowledge and mediators between humanity and the gods. These monuments reflect the community's engagement with the sky's powers. But what of the earth and water deities? Some clues come from archaeological records, such as pits dug in the 3rd and 2nd millennia BC that often contain collections of artifacts or animal bones, suggesting offerings to propitiate earth deities. One example is the mid-2nd millennium BC shaft found at Wilsford, near Stonehenge, which reached the water table. While it might have served as a well, the water from deep in the rock was likely seen as sacred. Throughout time, wells have been regarded with ambivalence, often associated with saints in medieval periods. In prehistory, any penetration of the soil might have been seen as a violation of the deity's domain, requiring offerings to mitigate the act. Bronze hoards, increasing in number through the late 2nd and early 1st millennia BC, may also represent propitiatory acts. They were often buried in pits or sunk in watery places, potentially dedicated to gods. The widespread evidence of weapons deposited in river valleys, such as the Thames, suggests offerings to deities residing in or controlling the water. Items placed in these locations might have been offerings to deities associated with the earth or water, intended to honor or appease them. While the evidence is fragmented and open to interpretation, it's clear that prehistoric beliefs were complex and varied. The practices and rituals surrounding death, the celestial bodies, and the deities of earth and water reveal a sophisticated understanding of the world and the divine. These beliefs likely laid the foundation for the later development of Druidism, which continued to evolve and adapt over time. As we continue to explore the archaeological record, we gain insights into the rich spiritual lives of our ancestors and the origins of the Druidic tradition. We should not forget the role of art in prehistoric belief systems, as it often provided a visual representation of the sacred. Rock art, found in various parts of Western Europe, offers clues to the spiritual world of prehistoric communities. The carvings and paintings often depict abstract symbols, animals, and human figures, possibly representing gods, spirits, or ancestors. Some of these artworks, such as the carved spirals at Newgrange or the cup and ring marks found across Britain and Ireland, may have held religious significance. These symbols might have represented the cycles of life, death, and rebirth, or served as markers of sacred spaces. The rituals, art, and architecture of prehistoric communities reveal a deep connection to the natural world and its cycles. These practices were likely part of a belief system that sought to maintain harmony between the human and divine realms. The Druids, as spiritual leaders, would have been the keepers of this knowledge, guiding their communities in the observance of these ancient traditions. Through their rituals, they would have sought to ensure the well-being of their people and the favor of the gods. The legacy of these practices can still be seen in the traditions and customs of later Celtic societies and offers a glimpse into the spiritual world of prehistoric Europe. The second half of the first millennium is a fascinating era for exploring religious beliefs and practices, especially during the time when the Druids were active. The evidence from this period is rich and diverse, offering a captivating glimpse into how deeply ritualistic behavior was woven into the fabric of daily life. In this chapter, we'll delve into the array of available data, focusing on how ritual practices permeated society. Instead of relying on classical sources, we'll let the archaeological evidence speak for itself, revealing a world where ritual influenced every aspect of existence. A key element of this era was the handling of the dead, which varied significantly across regions and times. Elite burials, in particular, were often elaborate, with grave goods reflecting the individual's status. In Eastern Gaul and Southern Germany, for example, high-status burials involved placing the deceased in wood-lined chambers filled with a wide range of grave goods. The famous burial at Vix in eastern France, where a woman was laid on a four-wheeled vehicle surrounded by Mediterranean wine-drinking equipment, and the Hochdorf burial in Germany, where a male aristocrat was laid on a bronze couch with gold-adorned equipment, highlight the opulence of these practices. This tradition of elite burials with vehicles, weapons, and feasting gear continued in various regions, including the Marmozelle area and even as far as Yorkshire, well into the 3rd and 2nd centuries BC. While elite burials often involved inhumation, other burial rituals were also common. Excarnation, the practice of exposing the body above ground, was widespread. The absence of other burial modes, along with the discovery of body parts in domestic settings and the occasional tightly wrapped bodies, suggests that the deceased were first exposed in designated areas before their remains were either buried or reincorporated into the community as revered ancestors. Evidence of such practices has been found at Sutton Farm in Hampshire, where tightly wrapped bundles of bones were interred near a settlement, and in southeastern Britain and Gaul, where disarticulated bones found on settlement sites indicate a form of reincorporation. Cremation became more prevalent, especially from the end of the 2nd century BC in northern Gaul and southeastern Britain. The cremated remains were often placed in urns, sometimes accompanied by pottery vessels containing food or drink, and occasionally metal wine-drinking equipment, indicating the deceased's elevated status. Some cremations were elaborate, involving large chambers with offerings of food, wine, and personal items. A striking example from Folly Lane near Verulamium, St. Albans, in the 1st century AD involved a body being laid out with grave goods for viewing, then cremated, with the grave goods smashed before the pit was filled in, a clear indication of a carefully orchestrated departure ritual. Despite regional and chronological variations, the care given to the dead is evident, particularly among the elite, where grave goods were a constant feature. This ritualized treatment of the dead suggests a belief in an afterlife that mirrored the deceased's earthly status. The burial of corpses, bones, or cremated ashes was likely seen as part of a broader ritual involving offerings to chthonic deities, with the possibility that cremated remains were also deposited in rivers or lakes, paralleling the deposition of tools and weapons in watery places. Depositing offerings in water and earth was a deeply rooted tradition that continued throughout the first millennium. The River Thames, for instance, yielded a surprising amount of elite Iron Age metalwork, including swords, shields, and helmets, with the tradition peaking just before the Roman invasion. The Waterloo Bridge helmet and the Battersea shield, both exquisite examples of craftsmanship, highlight the lengths to which people went to appease the gods. The concentrated discovery of artifacts in certain stretches of rivers suggests specific locations were favored for these deposits, with sites like Llyn Serigbach in Anglesey and La Tine on Lake Neuchâtel in Switzerland standing out for their significant finds. Earth depositions, too, continued until the Roman conquest. These included spectacular hoards of precious metals found in places like Snettisham in Norfolk, where torques, coins, and other items were buried in pits, possibly within sacred enclosures. Storage pits, common in late first millennium settlements, often became repositories for votive offerings, including artifacts, food, and even human remains. The presence of human remains, especially complete skeletons, raises the question of human sacrifice. While some remains may represent revered ancestors, others suggest more sinister rituals, possibly involving live sacrifices. One of the most striking examples of ritual killing is Lindow Man, found in a bog in Cheshire. His violent death, involving a blow to the head, garroting, and throat cutting, followed by his placement in a bog, strongly indicates a ritualistic sacrifice. The head, often seen as a powerful body part, receives special treatment in many cases. Temple sites in southern France, like Rocapertis, featured human skulls set in niches or displayed on posts, highlighting the significance attached to the head. This belief in the head's power persisted through various periods, as seen in Neolithic sites like Hambledon Hill, where skulls were placed in the ditches of enclosures. While ritual practices were widespread, specific locations were designated as temples or shrines. In southern France, these often incorporated stone architecture with statues of gods or heroes, while in northern Gaul and Britain, they were typically timber-built. The temple at Gournay-sur-Oran, for instance, was a sacred site from the 4th century BC to the 1st century AD, with evidence of animal sacrifices and the deposition of weapons and animal remains. Another type of religious site, the Virex-Shanzen, found in western Central Europe, contained timber-built shrines, burials, and shafts or wells. The example from Holthausen in Bavaria, with its deep shafts and evidence of flesh or blood offerings, indicates a connection to ritual practices, possibly involving water for religious purposes. Water sources, particularly springs, were revered as places where water from the underworld emerged into the human realm. These springs were often believed to have curative properties, as seen at the source of the Seine, where a shrine to the goddess Sequana was discovered, along with a collection of wooden ex-votos representing various parts of the body. Similar practices were observed at Chamalières, near Clermont-Ferrand, where pilgrims offered wooden figurines at a curative spring. The tradition of religious sculpture in Western Europe is also noteworthy. Wooden carvings, though rarely preserved, were likely widespread, while stone sculptures reflect a variety of traditions. The temple at Rocapertis, for instance, featured stone elements like columns, friezes, and carvings, including a two-headed figure reminiscent of the Roman god Janus. The emphasis on severed heads in the sculptures of southern Gaul suggests a unique belief system in the region. In other parts of Europe, such as southern Germany, religious sculptures included life-sized figures, like the bearded man from Glauberg, who may have represented a deified hero. The recurring motif of leaf crowns, found on statues and pillars, indicates a significant cultural symbol, possibly denoting exalted status. As time progressed, religious sculptures became more realistic and specific, often depicting gods with identifiable attributes. Examples from different parts of France, such as the figurine from Paul holding a lyre, the statue from Euphignius adorned with a boar, and the bronze figure from Boré with hoof feet, suggest a rich tradition of religious representation. In conclusion, the second half of the first millennium was a period of intricate and varied religious practices, deeply embedded in the daily lives of the people. From the elaborate burial rituals to the deposition of offerings in water and earth, and the reverence for specific body parts, these practices reflect a complex belief system that continued to evolve and adapt over time. The evidence we have, though often fragmentary, provides a compelling glimpse into a world where the sacred and the everyday were inextricably linked. The material we have on Druidism is as challenging as it is fascinating. The records are heavily influenced by the biases of the original writers, span observations across centuries and vast geographical regions, and often survive only through third or fourth-hand accounts of now-lost texts. Adding to the complexity, the existing records are extremely fragmented. Despite these difficulties, it is precisely the mystery and the process of unraveling these layers of transmission and understanding the minds behind the writings that makes the study of Druidism so intriguing. In the first chapter, we encountered the widely accepted notion that there are two main traditions in classical writings about the Druids, the Posidonian and the Alexandrian, with additional contributions from those writing during the Roman Empire. While this classification is broadly correct, the reality is more nuanced. A more accurate approach might involve examining the sources chronologically, tracing the entry of raw data into the stream of available knowledge. The earliest insights into the behavior of the native populations were made by Greek settlers in southern Gaul around 600 BC, followed by more extensive observations as the Roman world became increasingly involved in the region during the 2nd and early 1st centuries BC. Each phase of contact, Greek, late Republican, and Imperial, generated distinct traditions in the accounts of Druidism. The establishment of the colony of Massalia, modern-day Marseille, around 600 BC by Greeks from Phocaea, marked the beginning of formal interactions between the Greek world and the barbarian inhabitants of Western Europe. This was the result of decades of exploration along the Mediterranean coasts of Gaul and Iberia. Following the founding of Massalia, Other colonies sprang up along the coast, and it was through these settlements that Greek historians like Hecataeus of Miletus and Herodotus learned about the Celts. The settlers also launched expeditions into the interior, with figures like Pytheas of Massalia embarking on remarkable journeys in the 4th century BC, exploring regions as far as Britain, perhaps even Iceland, and documenting his findings in a now-lost work called On the Ocean. Though the book no longer exists, it was widely cited by later Mediterranean writers, becoming a key source of information on the wild northwestern extremities of Europe. Pytheas' observations were passed down through various channels, influencing writers such as Timaeus of Tauromenium, Eratosthenes of Cyrene, and later Strabo. These authors, in turn, informed the works of figures like Cicero, Pliny, and Diodorus Siculus, who, despite being Mediterranean-based, offered descriptions of the Celts and Druids. It's likely that much of what we know about Druids from these sources can be traced back to Pytheas. Another significant figure was Hecataeus of Abdera, who wrote about the Hyperboreans, a semi-mythical people believed to inhabit the far northwest. Diodorus Siculus, quoting Hecataeus, describes an island beyond the land of the Celts, home to the Hyperboreans, who worshipped Apollo in a circular temple, possibly a reference to the many stone circles found in the British Isles, such as Callanish on the Isle of Lewis. This account may represent the earliest surviving record of a lunar-based religion in the region, connected to the practices of the Druids. The tales brought back by explorers like Pytheas, and possibly others we know nothing about, spread among Mediterranean scholars and eventually found their way into works like Magicus, falsely attributed to Aristotle, and Socian's succession of philosophers. These writings formed the foundation for later Greek accounts of the Druids, with scholars like Alexander Cornelius Polyhistor, Timagenes, and Posidonius building upon them. These secondary and tertiary sources, recycled through the writings of Christian authors like Clement of Alexandria and Cyril of Alexandria, have provided us with a fragmented yet invaluable glimpse into Druidic practices and beliefs. Despite the challenges of piecing together this historical puzzle, what stands out is the respect that Greek writers had for the Druids. They are consistently portrayed as philosophers and wise men, ranking among the great thinkers of the barbarian world, alongside the Egyptians, Persians, and Indians. The distinction between the Galatai Gauls, who had Druids, and the Celts served by philosophers may reflect the confusion over the nomenclature of Western European peoples, or perhaps an ethnic division within the region. Greek writers also emphasize the Druids' role in governance, with figures like Dio Chrysostom noting that kings relied heavily on Druidic counsel. Strabo adds that the Druids were not only versed in natural science, but also in moral philosophy, and they were entrusted with making important decisions for the community. Caesar, Diodorus, and Strabo all highlight the Druids' belief in the immortality of the soul, a concept that intrigued the Greeks, who associated it with the teachings of Pythagoras. The notion of the Druids as astronomers, observers of celestial phenomena, is supported by both literary and archaeological evidence. The famous Coligny calendar, dating to the 1st century AD, is believed to be a product of Druidic knowledge, used to regulate annual ceremonies and predict celestial events. This calendar aligns with Caesar's observation that the Celts reckon time by counting nights, not days. One of the few surviving descriptions of a Druidic ceremony comes from Pliny the Elder, who details the ritual of cutting mistletoe from an oak tree. This rite, performed with great ceremony and precise timing, underscores the Druids' control over knowledge and their power within society. The Druids' expertise in herbal medicine, as noted by Pliny, further highlights their deep connection with nature and their role as guardians of ancient wisdom. Pliny also offers an etymological insight, suggesting that the name Druid may derive from the Greek word for oak, drus, combined with a root meaning to know, making them those with knowledge of the oak. This interpretation, though speculative, reinforces the idea of the Druids as holders of deep, esoteric knowledge. In summary, the Druids emerge from these ancient accounts as a powerful intellectual elite, deeply involved in the spiritual and temporal affairs of their communities. They were philosophers, astronomers, and healers, revered by their people and respected by those who encountered them. The challenge of reconstructing their history from fragmented and biased sources only adds to the allure of this enigmatic group, whose influence extended far beyond the narrow confines of the classical world. The southern coast of France, stretching between the Alpes Maritimes and the Pyrenees, is a region rich in history and geography, known for its fertile lowlands and easy accessibility. During the 2nd and 1st centuries BC, this area was densely populated with communities that thrived in fortified hill towns. The Rhone and Aude rivers, both major waterways, played a crucial role in connecting this region to the broader world. The Rhone provided a route northward into Central Europe, while the Aude offered access westward through the Carcassonne Gap, reaching the Garonne and the Atlantic Ocean. These rivers had long served as conduits for trade, linking the Mediterranean with the interior regions. Despite the challenges posed by the coastline, with its sand and gravel bars and extensive marshes, the enterprising Greeks established several port cities such as Nicaea, Antipolis, Olbia, Toroenttian, and Massalia to the east of the Rhone Delta, and Agatha, Rhode, and Emporion to the west. These ports became essential hubs for trade and exchange from the 6th century BC, not as aggressive colonies, but as self-sufficient trade outposts on the edge of an unfamiliar hinterland, similar to the later roles of Hong Kong and Macau. While the Greek ports flourished, only a few towns inland, like St. Blaise, Glannon, and Lattes, adopted Hellenic influences. Most native communities remained on their traditional hilltop settlements, although many, such as Enserun, Nages, and Entremont, integrated architectural and planning elements from the Greek coastal cities. The local population, divided into tribes labeled as Celts or Ligurians, maintained their distinct cultural identities. The term Ligurians generally referred to those in the eastern region near the Alpes Maritimes, while Celts described the natives encountered by the Massalia settlers. Despite the Mediterranean influences, indigenous beliefs and practices persisted, such as the widespread cult of the severed head, practiced by communities just 40 kilometers from Massalia. Roman interest in southern Gaul intensified at the end of the 3rd century BC, primarily due to the escalating conflict with Carthage, which had established a power base in southeastern Iberia. Although a temporary agreement divided Roman and Carthaginian interests along the river Ebro, hostilities resumed in 218 BC with Rome's declaration of war on Hannibal. The Second Punic War, concluding in 206 BC with the Roman capture of Gades, Cadiz, led to the organization of the Iberian Peninsula into the provinces of Hither and further Spain. Subsequently, Rome focused on subjugating the warlike tribes of the interior, achieving relative peace only after the destruction of Numantia in 133 BC. The Iberian campaigns had significant repercussions for southern Gaul. Roman and Carthaginian armies traversed the region during the Second Punic War, and the coastal routes became vital for sending supplies and reinforcements to Iberia. This constant movement of people and goods through southern Gaul in the late 3rd and 2nd centuries BC undoubtedly influenced the local communities, even as most traffic remained concentrated in the Greek cities. These events also heightened Roman awareness of Celtic barbarian culture, as native hill tribes began targeting Roman supply columns and Greek ports for raids. The eastern route near the Alpes Maritimes was particularly dangerous, with Roman governors' baggage trains being attacked multiple times, prompting appeals from Massalia for Roman assistance against Ligurian attacks. In 125 BC, the situation escalated when the Saluvii, neighboring Massalia, threatened the city, supported by increasingly aggressive tribes from the Massif Central and the Rhone Valley. Roman consular armies were dispatched, this time to establish a permanent presence. The Saluvian capital of Entremont was destroyed in 123 BC, and a military base was set up at Aquae Sexti, modern-day Aix-en Provence. The war extended into the barbarian hinterland, culminating in 121 BC with a decisive Roman victory against the Celtic Confederation near the confluence of the Isère and Rhone rivers. Following this conflict, southern Gaul was transformed into the Roman province of Transalpina. A citizen colony, Narbo Martius Narbonne, was founded in 118 BC, and a new market town, Forum Domitii, was established near the old Greek port of Agatha, all connected by the Via Domitia, a major highway linking Italy to Iberia. However, peace was not easily achieved. From 109 BC, northern barbarian tribes, notably the Cimbri and Teutons, wreaked havoc in the new province until they were decisively defeated in 102 BC at Aquae Sexti and in 101 BC at Vercelli in northern Italy. This period of unrest led the Volsi tribe to rebel, resulting in the massacre of a Roman garrison at Tolosa, Toulouse, and a brutal Roman counterattack that ended with the sacking and permanent occupation of the city in 106 BC. During this campaign, Roman general Scipio notoriously looted a Celtic temple, an act that deeply offended the local population. The unrest continued with rebellions in 90 BC by the Saluvii and further uprisings in 83 BC. Transalpina was drawn into the power struggles between Roman warlords in Italy and Iberia, leading to further native unrest in the 60s BC, driven by the exploitative policies of successive Roman governors. The Allobroges of the Rhone Valley were particularly affected, necessitating repeated military interventions. Overall, the period from 218 to 60 BC saw Rome's increasing involvement in the affairs of the Celts and Ligurians of southern Gaul. For many Romans, Transalpina represented a frontier territory full of opportunities for trade and exploitation, as well as a place of cultural fascination where native Celts, old Greek families, and new Italian settlers coexisted, communicating in a mixture of languages and adapting to a rapidly changing world. For Mediterranean scholars interested in ethnography, Transalpina offered a rich field for study. One such scholar was Posidonius, c. 135 c. 50 BC, a Greek Stoic philosopher and polymath from Apamea in Syria. Around 95 BC, he settled in Rhodes, a hub of intellectual activity, and traveled extensively throughout the Roman world, gathering information for his numerous studies. Although most of his writings, including his great work Histories, have been lost, his observations were preserved through quotations in the works of later authors. During his travels, Posidonius visited Gaul between 95 and 50 BC, observing the beliefs and customs of the Celts and tracing Hannibal's famous journey through the Alps. He recognized that he was witnessing a society in transition and often noted when a practice belonged to former times. This raises the question of whether he was recording first-hand observations or contrasting his findings with earlier sources. It is difficult to distinguish between his original observations and his library research, except where he cites specific sources. Posidonius was not an impartial observer. As a Stoic philosopher, he idealized primitive people, contrasting their innocent simplicity with the corruption of the civilized world. This perspective influenced his descriptions of the Celts and Druids, whom he viewed through the lens of the noble savage. Despite this bias, his accounts, as interpreted by later scholars like J.J. Tierney, provide valuable insights into Celtic ethnography. Posidonius' writings offer a detailed look at the religious systems of southern Gaul in the early 1st century BC. Strabo, who relied on Posidonius' work, describes the intellectual elite of Celtic society, comprising three classes: the bards, who were singers and poets; the vates, who were seers and interpreters of sacrifice; and the Druids, who studied nature and moral philosophy. Diodorus, using the same Posidonian text, adds that the bards sang to lyre-like instruments, the vates performed augury and sacrifices, and the Druids were honored as philosophers and theologians who could intercede to stop battles. This tripartite division of wise men is echoed in later writings and reflects a sophisticated belief system with distinct roles for each group. The Druids, while not directly involved in sacrifices, were essential participants in these rituals, highlighting their central role in Celtic society. Posidonius also documented the practice of headhunting among the Celts, describing how they would attach the heads of enemies to their horses and display them on their houses. He noted that distinguished enemies' heads were embalmed with cedar oil and shown to visitors, even when offered their weight in gold for redemption. This practice is corroborated by archaeological evidence and other ancient writers, indicating its prevalence in Celtic culture. The religious sites of the Celts were equally intriguing. Diodorus mentions temples where large amounts of gold were dedicated to the gods, untouched by the natives due to religious reverence. Strabo refers to sacred lakes where silver and gold were deposited, and islands with unique religious practices, such as one inhabited only by women possessed by Dionysus. In summary, the writings of Posidonius, though filtered through his philosophical beliefs, offer a fascinating glimpse into the rapidly changing society of southern Gaul in the 1st century BC. His observations, preserved by later writers, provide valuable insights into the complex and sophisticated belief systems of the Celts, their interactions with the Greeks and Romans, and the enduring impact of these cultures on the region. Caesar's depiction of the Celtic world offers a fascinating glimpse into a society where the roles of its spiritual leaders, particularly the Druids, were far more nuanced than one might expect. While earlier traditions like that of Posidonius recognized a variety of spiritual functions, Caesar simplified the complex system into just two main classes: the knights and the Druids. Some argue this was a deliberate move to oversimplify, either for ease or propaganda, while others believe it reflects a real shift in the practices of the time, where the lines between different spiritual roles became blurred. There's speculation that Caesar's portrayal of the Druids as dangerous extremists was a strategic choice, aiming to link them directly to the practice of human sacrifice. This approach could have served to justify Roman intervention by painting the Druids as a menacing force. However, it's equally possible that Caesar was less concerned with the details and more interested in providing a general overview of Celtic religion. He begins by noting the Druids' dominance in religious matters, controlling public and private sacrifices and making authoritative decisions on all spiritual questions. Young men flocked to them for education, and they were held in high esteem by the people. Caesar also reiterates a common belief of the time, that Druids taught that souls did not die, but instead moved from one body to another. They engaged in deep discussions on cosmology, the size of the universe, the nature of the physical world, and the power of the gods. While much of this was already known, Caesar emphasizes three main points that likely stem from his own observations. Firstly, he highlights the immense power the Druids held within society. They served as judges in almost all disputes, whether between communities or individuals. Their decisions were final, and those who did not comply faced severe consequences, including being banned from sacrifices, a punishment considered worse than death among the Gauls. Caesar's detailed account of the Druids' judicial power suggests he was either deeply impressed by their authority or wanted his audience to be. Secondly, Caesar stresses the Druids' role as teachers, noting that large numbers of young men sought their instruction. He mentions this 3 times, underlining the significance of their educational role. He describes how the Druids were exempt from military service and taxes, privileges that attracted many students. Some trained for up to 20 years, learning the extensive oral traditions by heart, a practice Caesar seems to misunderstand as a deliberate attempt to keep knowledge exclusive and inaccessible. Finally, Caesar touches on the Druids' ability to exert influence across tribal boundaries. He describes them as a pan-national brotherhood led by an archdruid with supreme authority. They held an annual gathering in a sacred place believed to be the center of Gaul, where disputes from all over the country were settled. This assembly posed a potential threat to Roman control, as it provided a platform for anti-Roman sentiment. It's notable that when a major rebellion broke out in 52 BC, it began in the territory where these gatherings were held, though Caesar does not mention any direct involvement of the Druids. The Druids' annual assembly was likely a deeply ingrained tradition, and as Gaul became more Romanized, controlling this event became increasingly important. The solution came in 12 BC when Emperor Augustus' stepson, Drusus, dedicated an altar to Rome and Augustus at a sanctuary in Lugdunum, modern-day Lyon, declaring that the newly formed Council of the Gauls would meet there annually. This clever move brought the National Assembly under Roman influence, coinciding with the Celtic festival of Lugnasad. Caesar's account of the Druids is a testament to the significant power they wielded in Gaulish society. While his portrayal may have been influenced by his desire to justify Roman repression, it remains a valuable assessment of the period. Caesar also delves into the Gauls' religious practices, describing them as highly superstitious and prone to human sacrifice, especially in times of illness or battle. He recounts the infamous Wicker Man ritual, where human lives were exchanged to appease the gods. This vivid description, possibly borrowed from earlier sources, might have been intended to shock his readers and further justify Roman actions. The Romans, particularly under the rule of figures like Augustus and Tiberius, were intent on suppressing such practices. Strabo, citing Posidonius, mentions that the Romans had already put an end to such customs in the province of Transalpina. Later writers like Pomponius Mela and Suetonius continue this narrative, describing how the Druids' power was gradually eroded through legal prohibitions and military action. Even after their religious rites were officially banned, the Druids remained a symbol of resistance. Tacitus, writing about the Roman campaign in Britain in AD 59 60, describes a dramatic encounter with Druids on the island of Anglesey. He vividly portrays the scene where Druids, alongside women dressed as furies, attempted to terrify the Roman soldiers with curses and eerie rituals. Although the Romans eventually prevailed, Tacitus' account highlights the enduring power and influence of the Druids, even as they faced annihilation. In the centuries that followed, references to the Druids became increasingly scarce, but their legacy persisted. In late Roman Gaul, the memory of the Druids still held some weight, with figures like Ausonius mentioning them in passing. By the 4th century, being descended from Druids was even considered an honorable lineage. While their power may have waned, the mystique surrounding the Druids endured, shaping both historical and mythical narratives long after their decline. Julius Caesar's brief excursions to Britain in 55 and 54 BC mainly emphasized that the people there were quite similar to the Gauls, though he did make a tantalizing remark. It was believed that the Druids' teachings originated in Britain. Even in Caesar's time, scholars who wanted to delve deeper into Druidic doctrines were known to journey to Britain for their studies. Caesar's campaigns brought the southeast of Britain into close contact with the Roman world, leading to increased trade and mobility between Britain and the continent for nearly 90 years. It wasn't until AD 43, when Emperor Claudius decided to annex Britain, that Roman rule became official. During the conquest, the Romans had at least one significant encounter with the Druids when they attacked the island of Anglesey off the northwest coast of Wales in AD 59-60. Under the governor Agricola, Roman forces pushed deep into Scotland and even visited Orkney. But by the end of the 1st century AD, the frontier was settled along a line between the River Tyne and the Solway estuary, later marked by Hadrian's Wall. In the 2nd century, a new frontier, the Antonine Wall, was established between the Forth and Clyde, but this was short-lived, and the southern frontier became the established boundary. While Scotland's Highlands, the Northern and Western Isles, and Ireland remained outside Roman control, they were still accessible to traders. Throughout prehistory, Ireland was a key player in maritime trade networks across Europe's Atlantic-facing lands. However, trade dwindled after the mid-1st millennium BC, leading to Ireland's growing isolation. It wasn't until the 1st century BC that trade between Britain and Ireland picked up again. Caesar didn't mention Ireland, and Strabo, writing in the early 1st century AD, only relayed rumors that its people were wilder than the Britons, indulging in incest and cannibalism. These claims were vague and possibly based on older accounts from explorers like Pytheas, who had traveled around Britain in the 4th century BC. By the 1st century AD, Tacitus had more information and noted that Irish harbors were well known through trade, revealing that Ireland's land and people were similar to those of Britain. By the late 2nd century AD, the astronomer Ptolemy provided detailed coordinates for 55 locations in Ireland, including coastal features, tribes, and settlements. Roman artifacts found on Ireland's east and north coasts suggest these areas were the primary hubs for trade, with a significant port established at Dramana, near the mouth of the Liffey. In the 4th century, the nature of contact shifted, Some Irish people served as mercenaries in the Roman army, while others engaged in piracy against Britain. The early 5th century account of St. Patrick reveals more about this era. Captured by an Irish raiding party as a boy, Patrick was taken to Ireland as a slave. He eventually escaped and returned to Britain. During this tumultuous period, when Roman influence was waning, Irish communities began settling in Wales, Scotland, and possibly Cornwall. In 431, the Pope sent Palladius, a Gaulish churchman, to minister to the Irish. He initially worked in southwest Wales before moving to Ireland, but his mission had limited impact. The following year, Patrick returned to Ireland from Britain and, based in Armagh, launched a more successful mission. He traveled extensively, baptizing people, ordaining clergy, and establishing rural parishes. Simultaneously, in the mid-5th century, Christian monasticism began spreading from the Mediterranean through Atlantic trade routes. It quickly gained popularity, and by the 6th century, started to replace Patrick's parish system. Monastic communities became centers of learning and zealously promoted their brand of Christianity, gradually overshadowing pagan beliefs. These monasteries played a crucial role in preserving and transcribing Ireland's rich oral pagan traditions. Some scribes admitted their confusion over what they were copying, yet they carefully curated the presentation of pagan beliefs. Influenced by classical and biblical knowledge, they sought to find universal truths in ancient sagas, resulting in a blend of old and new. Despite their efforts, much of the pre-Christian essence remains in the vernacular literature we read today. Pre-Christian Ireland had a complex pantheon of gods, similar to pre-Roman Gaul. Originally controlled by the tribes of the goddess Dana, the gods later formed a diverse pantheon, residing mainly underground, but occasionally interacting with humans. Two principal deities were the Dagda and the Morrigan. The Dagda, a versatile god embodying virility and abundance, and the Morrigan, a fierce goddess of fertility and destruction, represented a balance of creation and annihilation. Another significant deity was Lug, contrasting with the Dagda's older, more rugged form. Lug, young and handsome, wielded weapons like the sling and spear, symbolizing a different aspect of divine power. This contrast suggests a dichotomy within the male deities, reflecting broader themes of traditional versus progressive forces in society. The cyclical nature of time was crucial to early Irish religious life, with the year divided into light and dark halves. This division, marked by festivals like Beltane and Samhain, governed agricultural activities and social gatherings. Samhain, the end of the year, was a time of transition, marked by feasting and preparation for winter. It was also a period when the boundary between the human world and the netherworld was believed to be particularly thin. The Christianization of Ireland incorporated some of these ancient festivals. All Saints' Day replaced Samhain, but Halloween retained elements of its pagan origins. Imbolc became St. Bridget's Day, and Beltane is still celebrated in various forms across Europe. In pre-Christian Ireland, society was divided into perhaps 150 tribes, each ruled by a king. The king had absolute authority within his tribe, commanding loyalty and military support. He also presided over assemblies where tribal matters were decided. Irish society was highly stratified, with detailed ranks and privileges outlined in legal texts. The elite class, including kings, clerics, and poets, held significant influence. This system mirrored the pre-Roman Gaul's Druids, Vates, and Bards, reflecting a blend of religious and political roles. In ancient times, the Druid, Fillid, and Baird were the revered figures who carried out the vital roles of their elite class. By the 2nd century BC in Gaul, the distinctions between the Vates and Druids were starting to blur, a trend that became even more pronounced in pre-Christian Ireland. The Druids, at the pinnacle of wisdom, acted as crucial intermediaries between the divine and the human realms. They settled disputes, foretold future events, and their foresight was highly sought after by kings planning new ventures. A significant aspect of their power was their ability to enforce Gisa, magical prohibitions that restricted a king's actions. For instance, a geist might forbid a king from eating horse flesh before riding into battle or from straightening his spear point with his teeth. Violating even a single geist could strip a powerful king of his strength. One tale recounts a king forbidden to speak until his druid spoke first, resulting in a puzzling silence at a gathering until the druid inquired about the issue. The Fillid, sharing the druid's gift of prophecy and insight, gained even more roles over time. They became teachers, with training taking up to 12 years, and took on responsibilities for poetry and satire previously held by bards. Bards remained, but were now mainly tasked with composing eulogies and preserving oral traditions through storytelling. The rise of Christianity intensified this shift, leading to the Druids' decline by the 7th century, while the Fillid evolved, preserving many ancient practices alongside the Church. They continued as a prominent order until the 17th century, when English bureaucracy led to their fall. In Irish pre-Christian sagas, Druids are vividly depicted. For example, Cathbad, a renowned Druid in the Ulster Cycles tale, the Táin Bó Cúailnge, served as both a warrior leader and a prophet to King Conchobar. Cathbad's predictions about heroes and events, such as Cú Chulain's fame and Deirdre's tragic fate, illustrate his role as a seer. He was also a mentor, teaching many students the druidic craft and attempting to shield Cú Chulainn from magical threats. Druids were portrayed as dream interpreters and divine mediators, capable of summoning storms or casting spells, like turning a young woman into a deer for rejecting a druid's advances. Irish texts offer scant details about their organization, but they were sometimes seen as solitary figures or in groups, and were led by an elected chief. Their gatherings were held at Uisneach, similar to the Gaulish Druids' assemblies in central Gaul. The Irish literature provides glimpses of Druids as powerful figures deeply entrenched in the courts of kings, acting as intermediaries between gods and men. Yet, as time progressed, they began to be seen more as magicians and sorcerers. The Christian scribes who recorded these stories often viewed them with disdain, suggesting that the Druids were being increasingly marginalized. The inevitable clash between Druidism and Christianity is evident in early records. The 7th century text Vita Brigiti mentions Saint Bridget's Druid foster father, depicted as benign but overshadowed by the Church's power. Another document from the 6th century, the First Synod of St. Patrick, details how oaths were sworn in the presence of Druids, who also wielded significant influence in warfare, erecting barriers and ensuring victory through their magic. However, as Christianity solidified its hold, the portrayal of Druids shifted. When Patrick confronted King Leogary and his Druids, a dramatic contest ensued. Patrick's prayer led to the death of a Druid, and at a feast, Patrick survived an ordeal by fire, symbolizing the Christians' victory over the Druids. This confrontation, including Patrick's defiant lighting of a fire on the Hill of Slain before the pagan Hill of Tara, marked the triumph of Christianity. By the 7th and 8th centuries, surviving Druids were relegated to roles akin to sorcerers and charlatans. The law tracts depict them as comparable to freeman farmers, focusing on love potions and spells rather than their former esteemed status. The Christian clerics began to assume the roles of the Druids, becoming the new philosophers and advisors, and their status was elevated above kings in some respects. The poets, or Philid, took on many of the Druids' functions, including legal and advisory roles, and their practice evolved into a complex system with distinct ranks. The Philid and bards combined aspects of the Gaulish bards and vates, wielding significant influence through their words and prophecies. Their powers, including the ability to impact their audience with satire or praise, were legendary. In the early 15th century, it was believed that a poet's spell could even cause death, and by the 16th century, poets were thought to possess the power to rhyme to death. Their skill in composing eulogies and praise poems could earn them substantial rewards, comparable to wealth amassed by kings or the church. The Philid's expertise extended to retaining the history and lore of their people, with top poets expected to know hundreds of stories. They received rigorous training for up to 12 years and played a crucial role in shaping legal and societal norms. Stories of their interactions with Christian figures, like St. Patrick, reflect their enduring influence. In Ireland, the Philid continued to serve as poets, advisors, lawyers, and seers until the 17th century when English rule led to their decline. Yet, the fear of their satirical power persisted into the 20th century, illustrating the deep-rooted legacy of their influence. Christianity's gradual dominance over Irish paganism is vividly illustrated in Giraldus Cambrensis' 12th century account of a king's inauguration ceremony. This ritual, which involves symbolic acts of communion with a mayor, highlights the persistence of ancient pagan traditions even in the face of a new religion's rise. Throughout history, humans have had a deep-seated desire to uncover their origins. Today, we can use advanced DNA analysis and archaeological research to build intricate models of our past. However, before the 19th century, tangible evidence was scarce, relying mainly on the Bible and a handful of classical texts. Medieval chroniclers had two main options for crafting their origin myths. They could start with the sons of Noah repopulating the earth after the flood, or draw from the grand legend of Rome's origins, as described by Livy, who claimed Aeneas fled Troy's flames to establish Rome. In 7th century France, the Franks were imagined to be descendants of King Francio, who ventured west after Troy's fall. Another version claimed Francus, descended from Noah's son Japhet, settled Europe after the flood. Francus supposedly had three brothers: Romanus, who founded the Gallo-Romans, Brito, the progenitor of the Bretons, and Albanus, the forebear of the Alemanni. The British chronicler Nennius later adjusted this tale, making Brito the founder of the Britons, and thus the myth continued to evolve. The real game changer came in 1135 with Geoffrey of Monmouth's Historia Regum Britanniae, which introduced a fully fleshed-out myth of British origins. Geoffrey, a Welsh cleric likely based in Oxford, claimed to have used an ancient Breton manuscript as his source, though evidence suggests this manuscript may not have existed. Geoffrey's story is captivating. Britain's history begins with Brutus, a Trojan hero who arrived around 1170 BC, defeated the island's giants, and founded New Troy, now London. Brutus's descendants, including Kings Lud, Cole, Vortigern, and Arthur, were said to connect to the early Saxon king lists, weaving a continuous narrative that fascinated the medieval world. Geoffrey's tale, though questioned by the 17th century, remained influential and was still regarded as historical fact by some well into the 19th century. In the 16th and 17th centuries, the biblical model of the flood and its aftermath influenced narratives like George Buchanan's Rerum Scoticarum Historia, Ayelet Sams's Britannia Antiqua Illustrata, and Paul-Yves Pézerin's Antiquite de la Nation et de la Langue des Celts. Pézerin's 1703 book, particularly influential, posited that the Celts descended from Gomer, Noah's grandson, spreading from the east across Europe to settle in Brittany and Wales. His ideas were widely accepted and brought the Celts into scholarly focus. By the 16th century, antiquarians had access to more historical materials than their medieval predecessors. With monastic libraries opening up, the works of classical writers like Caesar, Tacitus, and Pliny became more accessible. The printing press played a crucial role, making Caesar's Gallic Wars widely available in Latin, 1511, and in English translation, 1604, bringing detailed descriptions of Celtic society and Druidism to a broader audience. By the early 17th century, major texts about the Druids were in the public domain, allowing historians to enrich narratives with real personalities and vibrant details. This shift from medieval myths to more concrete historical sources was compelling, especially as people looked to the fierce, freedom-loving Celts as worthy ancestors. Yet, the Druids' pagan practices posed a challenge for a Christian audience. Druids were often depicted as philosophers and judges, which made them more palatable. Early French works like Jean Lefebvre's Les Fleurs et Antiquités de Gauls, 1532, and François Meinhard's Oration, The Mistletoe of the Druids as a Symbol of Jurisprudence, 1615, emphasized their philosophical and judicial roles. However, the more sinister aspects of Druidic practice, such as human sacrifice, could not be overlooked. Ayelet Sams's Britannia Antiqua Illustrata, 1676, vividly illustrated these darker elements, including an image of a wicker man filled with living victims. John Aubrey, writing in 1659 about Wiltshire's prehistoric inhabitants, depicted them as almost beastly, aligning with Thomas Hobbes's bleak view of primitive life as solitary, poor, nasty, brutish, and short. To reconcile this barbarism, some sought to frame the Celts in a more favorable light. The 16th century saw explorers like Magellan and Raleigh introduce European audiences to savage peoples, presenting them as noble savages living in a golden age. Jean-Jacques Rousseau later idealized this simpler state of humanity, contrasting it with the corrupting effects of modern laws. The Celts were seen as admirable for their untainted way of life, though their ignorance of Christianity led to their brutal practices. Yet, it was the Romans who, according to this view, civilized them. Some thinkers went further, proposing that Druidism and Christianity shared roots. Reverend Henry Rollins, in his 1723 work, Mona Antiqua Restaurata, argued that Britons descended from Gomer and that Druids were direct inheritors of Abrahamic religion. William Stukeley echoed this sentiment, embracing both Druidism and Christianity in his interpretations of ancient monuments like Avebury and Stonehenge. Unlike medieval chroniclers, 16th century antiquarians began to recognize and document physical remnants of the past. John Leland, a pioneer in this field, traveled England from 1536 to 1542, recording his observations in what would later be published as the Itinerary of John Leland. Although he repeated Geoffrey of Monmouth's tale of Merlin and Stonehenge, his efforts laid the groundwork for future study. Subsequent antiquarians like Inigo Jones and John Aubrey contributed to the understanding of these monuments. Aubrey, in 1649, linked Stonehenge and other megaliths with the Druids, shaping popular imagination and leaving a lasting legacy of Druidic association with ancient sites. Aubrey's theory gained traction, partly because it brought the increasingly popular concept of Druids to life. Edward Lewid, keeper of the Ashmolean Museum at Oxford, eagerly supported the idea, suggesting that megalithic monuments were once sacred sites for pagan rituals, with Druids as the ancient priests. Another enthusiastic adopter was John Toland, 1670 to 1722, who initially shared his ideas through letters to his patron Lord Molesworth in 1726, later expanding them into a book, Critical History of the Celtic Religion, 1740, which was later retitled The History of the Druids. Toland integrated Irish sources into the discussion, but as a controversial freethinker, his work faced significant criticism. A more compelling figure was William Stukeley, 1687 to 1765, a Lincolnshire doctor and antiquarian. He began his exploration of Stonehenge and Avebury in 1719 and spent the next 5 years meticulously documenting these sites and their cultural landscape. His work was precise and objective, aiming to write a book called The History of the Temple of the Ancient Celts. However, his ordination in 1729 shifted his focus to popular theories of patriarchal Christianity, influenced by the Reverend Henry Rollins. Rollins, known for his studies of Anglesea's monuments, relished Tacitus's description of Druidic altars soaked in human blood, arguing these altars were the megaliths scattered across the island. Rollins' views, published around the same time as Stukeley's fieldwork, likely influenced Stukeley's thinking. In 1740, Stukeley published Stonehenge, a temple restored to the British Druids, and 3 years later, Aberry, a temple of the British Druids with some others, described. Building on Aubrey's earlier work, Stukeley added his own observations, but framed his findings within a complex theological debate about the patriarchal religion of Abraham, its evolution into Druidism and Christianity. As his theories became more elaborate, Stukeley adapted his earlier objective observations to fit his evolving ideas, transforming what began as a careful antiquarian study into a theological narrative that defended the Church of England against deist critiques. In this process, the Druids were given a historical and architectural context, neatly integrated into the Church's progression and domesticated within this framework. What did these Druids look like? Aylett Sams provided a vivid image in his Britannia Antiqua Illustrata, 1676. His Druid is depicted as a tall figure, wearing a knee-length tunic and a hooded cloak, barefoot but distinguished by a long beard. Holding a staff in one hand, an open book in the other, and with a flask at his side, this image became iconic. Rollins and Stukeley, both influenced by Sams, modified the depiction slightly. Rollins replaced the book with an oak branch and gave his Druid sandals. Stukeley's Druid, with a more modest beard, stands beneath an oak tree, blending into a natural setting. This portrayal of the Druid, resembling an Old Testament patriarch, became a lasting model for later interpretations. By the mid-18th century, the Druid had been carefully placed within an intellectual context relevant to the time. In Britain and France, he symbolized a noble distant pre-Roman past, contributing to the emerging nation's sense of dignity, while also evoking a sense of danger, a reminder of the thin line between wisdom and savagery. This dichotomy resonated with the intellectual climate of the era, where classical texts provided a script and 17th and 18th century imagination turned it into a dramatic morality play. With all the elements in place, the stone circles, sacrificial altars, oak groves, and mistletoe, the Druids could now be envisioned as philosophers, bards, teachers, and priests set apart from everyday life but ready to lead their people against imperial threats. This engaging creation has endured, reflecting an enduring fascination with the Druids. Between roughly 1550 and 1750, the fascinating world of the Celts and Druids was rediscovered and reimagined through the eyes of Greek and Roman writers. They were transformed into central figures in a grand narrative of ancient religious continuity and were set against a backdrop of megalithic monuments where their captivating rituals were believed to unfold. This portrayal depicted them as wise, elderly figures, embodying a serene rural wisdom. Although this image was fitting for the era that created it, it was ultimately unsatisfactory. It lacked a sense of continuity, connecting the past to the present, and failed to embed these figures in a rich literary context. The Romantics of the late 18th century, with their boundless imaginations, stepped in to fill these gaps. The fascination with Celtic culture, or Celtomania, took off dramatically. The Breton priest Paul-Yves Pézerin's influential work, L'Antiquité de la Nation et la Langue des Celts, 1703, and Edward Lewis's Archaeologia Britannica, 1707, introduced the idea that modern French and British people were direct descendants of the ancient Celts. They argued that Celtic culture had survived in remote areas like Brittany, Cornwall, Wales, the Isle of Man, Scotland, and Ireland, where the ancient Celtic language and perhaps even some Druidic practices were still present. This notion sparked a surge in interest, with Celtic literature being discovered or even invented, and the idea of a distinct Celtic personality becoming a lively topic of discussion by the end of the 19th century. Celtomania persists today, though often in a commercialized form that reflects contemporary trends. In France, the enthusiasm for all things Celtic was fueled by a series of books like Simon Paludier's Histoire des Celtes, 1740, La Tour d'Auvergne's Origines Gauloises, 1796, and Jacques Cambray's Monuments Celtiques, 1805. These works delved into Druidic themes with great fervor, with Cambray even suggesting that the megalithic structures of Karnak were linked to Druidic astronomy. Meanwhile, in Britain, scholarly focus shifted to county histories, prominently featuring Celts and Druids. At the dawn of the 20th century, the French archaeologist Salomon Reinach, 1858 to 1932, reviewed this Celtomania with a hint of irony. The Celts are the oldest people in the world. Their language is preserved practically intact in Bob Breton. They were profound philosophers whose inspired doctrines have been handed down by the Welsh Bardic schools. Dolmens are their altars where their priests, the Druids, offered human sacrifice. Stone alignments were their astronomical observatories. As this enthusiasm for Celtic culture flourished, the Druid became a subject of imaginative transformation. In England, poet William Blake, 1757 to 1827, envisioned Britain as the Holy Land and Jerusalem as being near London's Primrose Hill. In his works, he portrayed Britain as the cradle of the patriarchal religion, suggesting that all things begin and end in Albion's ancient Druid rocky shore. Whether Blake genuinely believed his mystical visions is uncertain, but he acknowledged that his work was visionary or imaginative. Other poets also embraced Druidic themes. Reverend John Ogilvy, a Scottish minister, penned a poem, The Fane of the Druids, featuring a chief druid performing rituals under an oak tree set within a stone circle. The allure of druids extended to the elite. Field Marshal Henry Seymour Conway, after retiring as governor of Jersey, was gifted a megalithic structure by the islanders. He transported it to his home in Berkshire and erected it as a druid circle at Temple Combe, where it remains. Others, lacking genuine megaliths, built replicas. William Danby, 1752 to 1833, constructed a Stonehenge replica at Swinton Hall in Yorkshire, while Bishop George Henry Law of Bath and Wells created a Gothic-style roof structure. Driven by a desire for involvement, people also founded Druidical societies. One of the earliest was the Druidical Society of Anglesey, established in 1772, which functioned as a charitable organization with members wearing distinctive blue uniforms adorned with Druidic motifs. In 1781, the Ancient Order of Druids was founded in London, operating as a friendly society and continuing to this day. In England, where successive invasions had severed direct links to the Celtic past, people had to invent new traditions. However, in the more remote northern and western regions, enthusiasts sought genuine connections with their distant ancestors. In Wales, the bardic tradition, though waning, still persisted. Since the 12th century, poets and musicians were organized by a court authority that held periodic competitions known as Eisteddfodau. Although the tradition of bards was fading by the 16th century, the Eisteddfod continued sporadically. Queen Elizabeth I used the Eisteddfod in 1568 to control the rising number of vagrants, encouraging performers to demonstrate their skills. The Eisteddfod's fortunes varied over time, but saw a resurgence in the 18th century, fueled by the growing Celtic interest. London societies like the Simradorian and the Gwaendingen offered literary prizes, further boosting attendance. Edward Wilson, known as Iolo Morganwg, a member of the Gwaendingen, attended the 1790 Eisteddfod at St. Asaph. He believed that the bards were descendants of Druids, and that the Eisteddfod was essentially a Druidic ceremony. To enhance this symbolism, he invented new rituals. A report from the Gentleman's Magazine of 1792 described a gathering on Primrose Hill, where Welsh bards performed a ceremony involving a stone circle and a sword sheath. The elaborate rituals performed on Primrose Hill might have faded into obscurity if not for Iolo Morganwg's strategic move to impose his invented gorsedd on the unsuspecting Eisteddfod held in Carmarthen in 1819. Despite the Bishop of St. David's awkward discomfort and request to skip some of the ceremonial formalities, Iolo's charisma won the day, ensuring his Druidic fabrications were woven into the very fabric of the Eisteddfod tradition. Iolo boldly claimed that the ancient bardic traditions had endured unbroken in his native Glamorganshire from the Druids' time, and that he had unearthed texts and poems as evidence. He also asserted that he was initiated as a bard in the ancient manner, a custom supposedly preserved only in Glamorgan. However, it appears these texts and claims were mere figments of his imagination. Iolo's claims may have drawn inspiration from a collection of poems by the Reverend Evan Evans, published in Specimens of the Poetry of the Ancient Welsh Bards, 1746. Evans suggested that some of these poems could be attributed to a 6th century poet named Taliesin, who supposedly held the secrets of the Druids. Although Evans admitted the texts were obscure and challenging to translate, Iolo seized upon this work. In his 1794 collection, Poems, Lyric and Pastoral, Iolo argued that Taliesin's poems contained a comprehensive system of Druidism and supported this with a fabricated 16th century manuscript of 20 Druidic ordinances. This supposed manuscript, like much of Iolo's evidence, never existed. Iolo's fanciful inventions distorted genuine scholarship and misled future generations. The authentic remnants of the bardic tradition in 18th century Wales offered no real connection to a Druidic past. As the 19th century progressed, Celts and Druids continued to captivate Welsh literary studies. Books like Edward Davies's Celtic Researches, 1804, and The Mythology and Rites of the British Druids, 1809, heavily influenced by Iolo's fabrications, dominated the field. The publication of the Mabinogi collections by Lady Charlotte Guest, 1838, 1840, 1849, which compiled Welsh stories written down in the 11th or 12th centuries, did little to advance the debate. However, the foundation of the Cambrian Society in 1845 marked a fresh start, as Welsh scholarship began to anticipate a new narrative grounded in archaeological evidence, moving beyond the fanciful speculations of the past. Yet, at the annual Eisteddfod ceremonies, Iolo's spurious inventions continued to be celebrated as tradition. Meanwhile, in Scotland, the quest for a living Celtic tradition found its champion in James Macpherson, 1736 to 96. In 1760, Macpherson's fragments of ancient poetry collected in the Highlands of Scotland and translated from the Gaelic or Erse language was an immediate hit. Capitalizing on public enthusiasm, Macpherson published Fingal, 1762, and Tamora, 1763, claiming they were based on 5th century manuscripts by the Gaelic bard Ossian. These manuscripts were never produced and likely never existed. Macpherson may have used 16th century documents and poetic fragments to craft a saga that resonated with national aspirations. Ossian quickly became a European sensation, inspiring freedom movements in the early 19th century. Yet, not everyone was impressed. Horace Walpole found it dull, and Walter Scott dismissed it as an absolute tissue of forgeries. Today, Macpherson is seen as a product of his time, an enthusiastic creator whose imaginative flair overshadowed his scholarly integrity. His later book, History of Great Britain, 1773, continued to weave Druids into his elaborate fictional tapestry. Macpherson's vision of a vibrant Celtic tradition came during a period of intense social and economic upheaval in the Highlands. Following the suppression of the Jacobite Rebellion of 1745, the clan system was dismantled, leading to the Highland clearances and mass displacements. The quest for deep-rooted heritage was a natural response to this turmoil. In Brittany, society faced its own significant changes. The Armorican Peninsula, culturally distinct from the rest of France, was seen as backward and intensely religious from a Parisian perspective. During the French Revolution of the 1790s, the Bretons, opposed to the Jacobin cult of reason and the centralizing power of Paris, rebelled. With their insurgency, the Chouans, harshly punished by revolutionary forces. With the Bourbon Restoration after Napoleon's defeat, Brittany was reimagined as a land of noble savages, Celts living among ancient monuments from their prehistoric past. If the Karnak stones were Druidic temples, then the Bretons were their direct descendants, their language and customs seen as precious relics of a Druidic era. As one writer put it in 1845, it is there that the descendants of the Celts have maintained a dress and a physiognomy which are but Druidism in disguise. Amidst this intellectual excitement, young Breton aristocrat Vicomte Herzard de la Villemarque, 1815–95, began collecting ballads and poems, publishing them in 1838 as Barzaz Briai's Songs of Brittany. The book was hailed as a revelation of Brittany's Celtic spirit and inspired other collectors. In 1838, La Villemarque visited Wales to attend the Eisteddfod in Abergavenny, where he was admitted as a bard. Overflowing with excitement, he wrote to his father about being a titled bard and attending ceremonies that he believed were rooted in ancient rituals. His visit also included a stop at Oxford to consult Welsh manuscripts and a trip to Stonehenge, then still regarded as a Druid temple. In 1867, La Villemarque played a key role in organizing the first Inter-Celtic Congress at St. Brook, attended by representatives from all Celtic-speaking regions. By this time, however, doubts about the authenticity of his work had emerged. A critical review by R.F. Lumin, published alongside the Congress, accused La Villemarque of falsifying history. While his work faced skepticism, the discovery of his original notebooks in the 1960s shed light on how he gathered information from 1830s peasants. This find has helped restore La Villemarque's reputation, though many traditional songs he recorded have since faded. With the advent of the railway, Brittany, once a remote corner of France, became a tourist destination. Visitors from Paris and Britain flocked to see aging storytellers and young women performing traditional dances around menhirs. Souvenirs included postcards of the Archdruid of Menesham, a whimsical image of an old man with a sickle standing on a megalithic tomb, eyeing a young girl, representing the Druidic fantasy for eager tourists. In Ireland, the journey to rediscover the Celtic past took a different path, shaped by the devastation of the Great Famine in the 1840s, which wiped out much of the island's rich traditional culture. In 1852, antiquarian Sir William Wilde lamented the loss of old customs and festivals. Yet, by the late 19th century, Lady Gregory found a treasure trove of traditional tales among the impoverished in Galway, which she recorded in Poets and Dreamers, 1903. Her translation of the Ulster Cycle in Cuchulainn of Muirthemne, 1902, introduced the epic of the Táin to a broader audience, showcasing a lost Celtic world filled with heroes and druids like the cunning Cathbad and Finnegas the Bard. These romantic visions of Celtic heroes and mystical druids inspired efforts to preserve traditional cultures across Brittany, Wales, Ireland, and Scotland. The Celtic spirit came to symbolize resistance against the centralizing forces of London and Paris, but the Druid himself was increasingly relegated to the shadows, a relic of an era no longer central to the creation of national identities. The creation of neo-Druidic societies, beginning with the formation of the Druidic Society of Anglesey in 1772 and the Ancient Order of Druids in 1781, was, as we have seen, rooted in late 18th century Romanticism. This was the time of a nationwide vogue for societies of all kinds, societies serving newfound needs for people to come together with like-minded fellows in gatherings focused on mutual interests, offering the reassurance of group identity at a time when rapid social and economic change was disrupting and destroying traditional values. Societies took many forms. One of the more common were the charitable institutions set up for the benefit of members and their families, often with a wider brief to help society at large. These were the benefit and friendly societies inspired by the ideals of Freemasonry. Many adopted a distinct theme around which to organize their beliefs and ceremonies, and it was only to be expected in the age of romantic Celtomania, that Druidism would commend itself as an identifier. Thus, the Druidic Society of Anglesey and the Ancient Order of Druids. The Druidic Society of Anglesey included among its membership most of the local clergy and landowners. They contributed an average of 34 guineas annually to a fund used for a variety of good causes, most notably supporting apprenticeships for poor children and funding local agricultural societies by offering prizes for agricultural innovation. Grants were also given to support hospitals in Chester and Liverpool, as well as to help the poor and needy. The trappings of Druidism were kept to a minimum, though harpists were employed to enliven the meetings. When eventually the society was wound up in 1884, the remaining funds were divided between hospitals and supporting rescue at sea. The Ancient Order of Druids was set up by a London carpenter and builder, Henry Hurrell, in the King's Arms Tavern in Oxford Street as a simple benefit society, but it soon grew in popularity, taking on the structure of Freemasonry instituted in the early decades of the century. In its early years, the Ancient Order of Druids was essentially a social club for prosperous working people who came together for entertainment, listening to music and singing, reading poetry, and attending talks on scientific and artistic themes. They also supported charitable aims. As its popularity grew, lodges were set up in other parts of the country and abroad, and by 1831 total membership numbered over 200,000, spread over 193 lodges, with some as far afield as America, Canada, and India. With the growth came greater constitutional complexity, which coincided with the changing needs of members, particularly those in the industrial areas of the Midlands and the North. Tensions emerged which led to dissent and division. The principal issue of contention was the desire of many of the lodges in industrial regions to adopt the structures of a benefit society so that funds could be more easily used to support members in need. This was resisted by the wealthy Grand Lodge. Matters came to a head in December 1833, when the movement split, the Grand Lodge and its supporters retaining the original title, while the rebels reformed under the title of the United Ancient Order of Druids. The subsequent history of both orders was dominated by fission and secession, too tedious to recount. The only linking factor between them was the retention of the word Druid in the title. One of the scions, the United Ancient Order of Female Druids, founded in 1876, reflects the growing recognition of women in Victorian society. Whilst these Druidic organizations usually enliven their proceedings with the trappings of romantic Druidism, white robes, false beards, mistletoe, oak leaves, and the like, and use terms like archdruid and first bard, some making quite spurious claims to legitimate descent from the Druids of the classical world. They were, in essence, benefit societies and Freemasonry organizations serving the real social, economic, and emotional needs of a significant sector of the population. Caught up in the exponential changes spanning the period from the late 18th century to the early decades of the 20th century. With the development of the welfare state in the post-Second World War period, the need for such organizations greatly diminished, and the trappings and rituals of these old societies, still steeped in the fustiness of the Victorian era, became increasingly irrelevant to the post-war generation. Gradually, the factions have died away through inertia or fission to the point of extinction. One of the last to go, towards the end of the 1990s, was the United Ancient Order of Druids, leaving the original parent, the Ancient Order of Druids, as the last survivor of its many offspring. One reason for its longevity probably lies in its aristocratic tradition. Before the Schism of 1833, the Ancient Order had adopted a hierarchical structure which allowed an elite to distinguish itself from the general membership. This made it more attractive to the upper classes who could meet among their peers. Perhaps the most famous occasion in the public domain was the meeting of the Oxford-based Albion Lodge of the Ancient Order on August 15, 1908 in the grounds of Blenheim Palace at the invitation of the Duke of Marlborough, who was himself a member. It was at that meeting that the young Winston Churchill, recently appointed as president of the Board of Trade, was initiated into the Ancient Order. A photograph of the occasion shows the young man in a tightly buttoned suit with wing collar, surrounded by sickle-carrying Druids looking decidedly uncomfortable in ill-fitting white robes and hoods and ungainly long white beards. In later life, as a serious historian, one suspects he might have regretted the photograph, if not the occasion. 16. A meeting of the Ancient Order of Druids held at Blenheim, Oxfordshire, on August 15, 1908, at which Winston Churchill was introduced into the order. If the post-war period saw the virtual demise of the fraternal Druids, it was by no means the time of the decline of Neo-Druidism. The 1960s, with its sense of new freedoms and new values tinged with an eagerness to explore mysticism, proved to be fertile ground for what has come to be a rapid growth in the invention and practice of neo-pagan beliefs. More recently, as the Green Movement has gathered strength, so Neopaganism has increased in its popularity. Neopaganism takes many forms, with shamanism, Odinism, Wicca, and Neo-Druidism being among the more prominent. All share a reverence for the natural world and a sense of being one with it, and all respect the rhythm of the seasons, many choosing to hold their ceremonies on the solstices or at the time of the four major ceremonies of the Celtic calendar. There is also a widespread belief in the polarity of the deity, the competing but balanced opposites of the male and female components. In professing these values, the neo-pagans have gone back to some of the essential elements that can be discerned in the belief systems of pre-Roman Celtic Europe and, in particular, of Ireland. This has been a conscious seeking out and selection of those values and beliefs that satisfy current needs. With growing concerns about the future of the planet, it is likely that this form of paganism will attract increasing numbers of followers. Within this broad neo-pagan context, a number of groups styling themselves Druids have emerged. One of the largest and more successful of these is the Order of Bards, Ovates and Druids, which was founded in 1964. Its principal aims are to help the individual develop his/her innate capacities to the full and to respect and care for the natural world. Its well-organized website, http://www.druidry.org, begins with the all-embracing statement. Druidry has become a vital and dynamic nature-based spirituality that is flourishing all over the world, and that unites our love of the earth with our love of creativity and the arts. And flowing through all the exciting new developments in modern Druidism is the power of an ancient tradition, the love of land, sea and sky, the love of the earth our home. The order runs a correspondence course, enabling members to aspire to the grades of bards, ovates, and druids. The first course is currently available also in an audiovisual version. Another group, the Insular Order of Druids, founded in 1993, recognizes the same three grades, basing their understanding of the attributes and functions of each closely upon those defined in the Posidonian tradition. Thus the bard is the storyteller and the singer of ballads. The ovate practices divination and is proficient in philosophy, while the druid helps initiates to harmonize with the natural world. The rise of modern Druidic societies began with the founding of the Druidic Society of Anglesey in 1772 and the Ancient Order of Druids in 1781, deeply influenced by the Romantic spirit of the late 18th century. This era saw a surge in various societies, reflecting a growing desire for communal identity and support amidst rapid social and economic upheavals. These societies, often modeled after Freemasonry, were primarily benefit and friendly organizations, offering members a sense of belonging and mutual aid. In this climate of romantic Celtomania, Druidism emerged as a compelling theme for these new social groups. The Druidic Society of Anglesey attracted local clergy and landowners who contributed generously to fund various charitable causes, such as supporting apprenticeships, agricultural innovation, and hospitals. Despite its Druidic name, the society focused on practical aid and kept ceremonial elements minimal, employing harpists to enhance their gatherings. When the society closed in 1884, its remaining funds went to hospitals and maritime rescue efforts. Conversely, the Ancient Order of Druids began as a modest benefit society founded by London carpenter Henry Hurrell in a tavern on Oxford Street. It quickly expanded, adopting a structure similar to Freemasonry and attracting prosperous working people who enjoyed social events, music, poetry, and charitable work. By 1831, the order had grown to over 200,000 members across 193 lodges worldwide, including the Americas and India. However, internal conflicts arose as industrial lodges sought to focus on direct support for members, leading to a split in 1833. The original Grand Lodge retained the name, while dissenters formed the United Ancient Order of Druids. The history of these orders is marked by splits and divisions, with the only constant being the word Druid in their titles. Notably, the United Ancient Order of Female Druids, established in 1876, highlighted the growing recognition of women in Victorian society. Despite the Druidic trappings such as white robes and ceremonial terms like Archdruid, these organizations primarily functioned as benefit societies addressing the social and emotional needs of their members. As the welfare state developed post-World War II, the relevance of these societies waned. Their Victorian-era rituals and traditions became increasingly obsolete, leading to their gradual decline. The Ancient Order of Druids, retaining a hierarchical structure that appealed to the upper classes, survived longer than its offshoots. A notable moment was the 1908 initiation of Winston Churchill into the Ancient Order at Blenheim Palace, a photograph of which humorously contrasts his formal attire with the Druids' elaborate robes. The decline of these fraternal organizations did not signal the end of Druidic interest. The 1960s, with its quest for new freedoms and mysticism, saw a resurgence in Neopaganism, including Neo-Druidism. This modern movement embraces a reverence for nature and the cycles of the seasons, incorporating elements from ancient Celtic beliefs and practices. Groups like the Order of Bards, Ovates, and Druids, founded in 1964, focus on personal development and environmental respect, with their websites celebrating the fusion of creativity and earth worship. Other groups, such as the Insular Order of Druids, formed in 1993, follow traditional roles of Bard, Ovate, and Druid, focusing on storytelling, divination, and harmony with nature. Neo-pagan Druidic groups vary widely, including those tailored to specific needs, such as the Golden Gate group for LGBTQ+ members, and the Hasidic Druids blending Hebrew and Druidic traditions. While modern Druidism aligns with environmental and spiritual concerns, some groups have ventured into contentious areas, such as claims over prehistoric burials, challenging the scientific community. The evolution of Druidism remains dynamic, balancing between its gentle, nature-centered roots and contemporary controversies. The title of this chapter hints at a belief that the Druids were a relic of the past, and that modern individuals claiming to be Druids since the 17th century lack any true connection to the ancient practices. Our exploration reveals that the esteemed class of bards, vates, and Druids was rapidly evolving by the early 1st millennium AD, even in Ireland, where Roman influence was minimal. Internal societal shifts and the rising influence of Christianity were key factors in the decline of Druidism, with Viking invasions and Anglo-Norman settlements further accelerating its end. By the time these changes were complete, only itinerant bards and storytellers remained in the Celtic regions of Britain and Ireland, with Brittany only hosting a few eccentric storytellers by the pre-World War I era. The 16th century's growing access to classical texts and the Renaissance's thirst for historical understanding sparked a fascination with Celtic history and the Druids. Since then, each generation has reinvented the Druids to fit contemporary aspirations and needs. The 18th century saw imaginative fabrications. The 19th century added a touch of allure to social clubs and lodges. And the late 20th century's neo-pagans sought to revive the core values of ancient religions to align with modern environmental concerns. While these modern revivals are intriguing, they don't answer our central question: who were the Druids? Evidence suggests that by the 4th century BC, a religious class, including Druids, existed in Western Europe, though the structure of this class became clearer only by the 2nd and 1st centuries BC. The bards were poets and songwriters with the power to influence reputations. The vates were diviners who interpreted signs to predict the future, and the Druids served as philosophers and intermediaries between people and gods. Classical texts indicate that changes were underway by the 1st century BC, accelerated by Roman influence. One intriguing question is the origin of Druidism. It's no longer acceptable to view it simply as a religion that spread from a central Celtic region through migration. Instead, there's growing support for the idea that the Celtic language, and potentially Druidism itself, originated in the Atlantic zone of Europe. Caesar's claim that Druidism began in Britain and required study there may reflect a widely held belief rooted in Gaulish tradition, suggesting that the Atlantic zone was central to ancient Celtic culture. A review of ritual practices in Western Europe reveals traditions dating back to the 4th and 3rd millennia BC, hinting at a degree of continuity from prehistoric times. Megalithic monuments and chambered tombs aligned with solstices indicate a sophisticated understanding of celestial movements by the 3rd millennium BC. Ritual practices like deliberate deposition and deep ritual shafts reflect beliefs in the spirit's journey after death, a belief attributed to the Druids by classical writers. Even the focus on the human head in 1st century rituals can be traced back to the Neolithic period. These connections suggest that the belief systems underpinning Druidism might extend back to the Neolithic era. Druidism, as recorded in the late 1st millennium, could be seen as a continuation of religious practices developed over the previous 3 millennia in Atlantic Europe. If accepted, this view would link megalithic structures like Stonehenge and Avebury to the Druids, a notion that would have delighted 18th century antiquarians. However, the situation is more complex. Around the mid-2nd millennium BC, substantial social and economic changes occurred in Western Europe. The end of megalithic monument building and ancestral burial practices gave way to individual burials and cremations. This period also saw increased landscape control with permanent boundaries and settlements. Such changes suggest a shift in belief systems, possibly driven by population growth and mobility. These mid-2D millennium changes might have been when Druidism began to emerge. As communities became more reliant on agriculture, a calendar attuned to lunar months and seasonal festivals might have developed, evident in the Coligny calendar and Irish traditions. This period also saw a rise in offerings to chthonic deities, reflecting a conceptual balance between earth and sky. This continuity in belief systems could mean that Druidism, as seen in classical sources, has roots in changes occurring 1,000 years earlier, with some knowledge and practices possibly dating back even further. The decline of Druidic traditions came swiftly with Roman dominance. Romanization suppressed many practices, replaced native gods with Roman deities, and introduced new religions, making old beliefs increasingly irrelevant. While some pagan practices persisted in remote areas, they were ultimately eradicated by the rise of Christianity and subsequent migrations. In Ireland, where Roman influence was lighter, Druidism was gradually replaced by Christianity. Druids were diminished to mere magicians, Vates became clerics, and bards remained as entertainers. By the 17th century, the remnants of the ancient intellectual elite had vanished, leaving only faint echoes of their once significant role.